There you go.
Okay, well, you new students have already had a chance to meet Rufus Stephens, but for those of you that have been in the closet for the last 5 years, Rufus is a superhero of the master naturalists. He is one of the people that thought up the idea and more than 20 years ago, and he's been working as a wildlife biologist ever since. He spent some time in Kansas doing this kind of work, and then was 23 years with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So he knows what he's talking about. He has written a book with Jan Reed on attracting birds in the Texas Hill Country. And I know we have that at the Riverside Nature Center, but if you have trouble finding it, it comes from the A&M bookstore, which is a good place to find any books you need. So I am excited to hear him explain something that everybody that's new to Texas wonders. If you have moved here from somewhere else, I'm sure it has entered your mind, why in the world are there so many deer walking around? So, Rufus, it's all up to you.
All right. Thank you. Actually, it's also great to see or to recognize that a whole bunch of friends are on there. Lucy and Andy and Nash and Coey and Louisa. Just a bunch of folks that I know. So, and I'm sure there's other folks that I missed. But so what I'm going to do is, this is actually a presentation that I normally give to the class. Some of y'all may recognize this. We're going to try to go through it pretty quick. I'm going to just kind of hit some of the highlights and try to give us enough time to have a discussion at the end. This topic usually brings up lots of questions. And what I'm going to talk about is the overabundance of white-tailed deer and exotics. Basically, I'm going to talk about the impact and current solutions, and that's kind of where we're going to really get into our discussion. This is a topic that actually they have written books on this, so it's been thought about and discussed a lot, and we certainly have our share of issues related to overabundance of deer. So we might start with what's the right number of deer, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that as we kind of move on. You know, so what is the right number of deer out there? And I'm going to just touch on white-tailed deer biology and exotic biology very quickly. We're going to talk a little bit about population trends and harvest trends. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ecological impacts, and we're going to finish with talking about population control options. And that's usually, but there are other aspects of this that people will have questions about, but that's definitely a important issue. So white-tailed deer biology and exotics. And so kind of the basics, food for white-tailed deer, they basically eat forbs and browse, which are woody plants, and the protein content in those food sources is greater than 12% protein. And at times, their biological needs, like a nursing doe, that's as high as 20%. So, and they also have a requirement, those basic components of habitat, food, water, and cover. Water typically within a mile, and so there's really not many places in the hill country that we don't have water within that amount of space. And so also cover. The basic types of cover is basically protection, and that's dense cover nearby, and usually that's within 100 yards is kind of their basic requirement. If it's further than that and someplace they're wanting to feed, like an oat field, they'll do it at night or when it's or in the evening. And actually, deer are crepuscular. There's a $10 word for you, crepuscular. So they're not diurnal. They're not nocturnal. They're crepuscular. That means that they are active in the morning and the evening. Those are their primary activity periods. So the other aspect of cover is fawning, and basically those are grassy areas to hide their fawns. And they, for up to 2 weeks, they will nurse their fawns and then leave them and don't come back until they nurse them again. And that can be several hours. And people often think they're abandoned and they're not. That's a common issue, right? When, in June, we all of a sudden, Parks and Wildlife gets lots of calls about abandoned fawns. And it's like, no, they're not abandoned. Their food. The basic thing here is to remember that browse, the leaves and twigs of woody plants, forbs, broadleaf flowering plants, some people call them weeds, some people call them wildflowers, and mass, which are acorns and nuts, and includes things like prickly pear fruit. That's 75+% of their diet. Grasses make up very little, and it's a very specific time frames that it does when it's much higher protein. Feeding, this always comes up, and so we got to address it. Understand that corn is less than 10% protein. And remember, I said that they need at least 12% in their diet. So some professors, folks at A&M, will call it beer for deer. And so it's a high carbohydrate, but low protein diet. And it's like, I would like to think that I could live off beer, but no, I probably couldn't just drink beer and survive. Again, protein, high protein, they need high protein, greater than 12%. The other problem with now we're going to get into just what are the problems associated just with feeding. So one of the things that it habituates deer to people and increases problems with people. One of the things is it also concentrates damage around the feeder. And when there's a regular food source that shows up at a certain time, whether that's by a feeder or by putting it out, deer will not travel as far. There have been studies that have shown that they will not travel as far within the, Pavlov's dog, within the back of their mind, they have that feeder going off. And so they'll go and so that means that around the feeders, they tend to overutilize the habitat, where if those feeders were not there, they would not. They would be more evenly distributed across the landscape. It also increases disease problems and the spread of diseases. And this is looking at this deer that's in a yard. This is in Garden Ridge, on the outskirts of San Antonio. This deer, not only can you tell from its coat, but its hip bones. This is a deer that's in really bad shape. And this is a deer in extremely bad shape. And the reason for this, for both of those situations, the most common thing that we see is these are high parasite loads. And with Parks and Wildlife, when I was with Parks and Wildlife, we did some work on looking at what was the parasite load on some of these urban deer, and they were dramatically magnitude higher than deer in normal areas or in rural settings. So what the problem becomes is you're concentrating animals that potentially are expelling eggs from parasites, and then they're eating close to the ground. They pick up those parasites, and these some of those disturbing photos that I showed of deer, we often get people going, oh, this has got to be some kind of CWD, chronic wasting disease, which we do have in Texas, but is not in really any of our urban areas, or cities or communities other than Del Rio. It is in the Del Rio area now, but is that these are almost always parasite problems. When we look at those deer, they have typically three things: high parasite loads, very high parasite loads. They'll have acidosis, which I'll get into in just a second, and aflatoxin, which will all be part of the problem with feeding deer. So if you feed, then, you know, the thing is to keep it dry, clean, not on the ground. Acidosis, I already mentioned. Acidosis is basically an acidification of the rumen or the bloodstream. It's basically from getting too many carbohydrates, and you get acidosis, which is common in urban deer. Aflatoxin, which everybody should know that if you look at a bag of corn, flip it over, it'll be usually on the back side, be a little statement says less than 20 parts per billion aflatoxin. Some says less than 50 parts per billion, and aflatoxin at 200 parts per billion can be detrimental to deer. The problem is even though it has those statements on there, aflatoxin varies dramatically. And AgriLife did a research a number of years ago and basically found that there were considerable bags of corn that would have 500 to 1,000 parts per billion, so enough to impact deer's health. The bottom line is you know, if you care about healthy deer, don't feed them. It's just not good all the way around. Even if you go, well, I'm going to feed them higher protein, no, it just causes problems. Reproduction, it's important to know that with twins are normal. Actually, singles are almost as common in a healthy deer as are triplets. And so occasionally we'll see triplets and people will talk about triplets. Twins are normal. So to a little bit talk about the exotics. The main exotic that we're talking about is axis deer. And axis are probably the most numerous. They eat more grass than white-tailed deer. That's because they have a more complex rumen and digestive system, and so they can eat a lower quality forage and still do well. Single fawns are the norm. Breeding is typically from May through August. And it tends to be, because they come from India, they are tied to, just really biologically wired to a rainy season. And in India, it's only one time. They have one rainy season, the monsoon season, and that triggers their cycling. And but in Texas, we have two rainy seasons. We have May and June, and basically September and August, or September and October. And so we can get axis fawns almost any time of the year. And so people may have seen fawns, fairly small, young axis, even in the wintertime. One thing about their diet, they'll eat more grass and can eat low quality forage food, but they prefer the same things as white-tailed deer. So, and from a competition standpoint, they'll eat forbs and browse, which are the same thing white-tailed deer eat, but then they can shift their diet to grass if they need to. White-tailed deer cannot do that. A little bit about population. One of the things is carrying capacity. When we're talking about populations and their levels, carrying capacity, important concept. It's basically the ability of the land to support a population of wildlife. And basically reproduction decreases as the population approaches carrying capacity. And as the population exceeds carrying capacity, mortality increases. This is, long-term data from Parks and Wildlife showing the population trends. And one of the things to notice is notice that these blue bars on the top, that those are the number of fawns. And the green bars are the number of does. You can just visually look at this and see that there are less than one fawn to every doe. So twins are normal. And, we're seeing times where there is maybe only one fawn to every 5 does. So that's that increased mortality in the fawns associated with exceeding carrying capacity. And so we in Texas, in the hill country, we have been exceeding carrying capacity for white-tailed deer ever since the 60s. This is just more recent data for the Edwards Plateau, the hill country. And in 2005, Parks and Wildlife changed the survey method, so they don't like me to show that the other graph with this graph, because it's 2 different ways of collecting the data. But basically, you can see that there's this oscillation in the population, and there is looks like an increase over, the past 13 years, but that's probably in the long term, there's an increasing population, but it's oscillating. Again, it's exceeded carrying capacity. Here's just another way of looking at the trend over kind of that same time frame, a 10-year period, and basically looking at the number of does that are here in orange or red, and the number of fawns in blue. And you can see that that's that there are significantly more does than fawns, and that tells you that population's not in very good health. Harvest. So how many deer are harvested? So this number of prior to, like, back in the 70s when doe harvest was allowed, that the number of does that were harvested per buck were about before that they weren't allowed, but once it started, it was basically about half the number of does compared to bucks. It's gone up, and then it's stayed pretty steady with an equal number, and then it's just diverged a little bit in the past couple of years. So there are more bucks harvested on average than does, or just about equal in the long-term average. But that's not going to control the population. So how many is the right number of deer, as I asked earlier? What is carrying capacity? Well, of a piece of property. So, how many deer can live off this farm piece of ground? Well, until the crops are growing, not many. What about the cedar thicket? That doesn't have very high carrying capacity. This riparian habitat, on the other hand, may have some of the highest densities that we have in the hill country, or the highest carrying capacity in the hill country because of all the diversity that's there. Really good habitat from the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. This has, and even in uplands, has a good carrying capacity. And we often don't think about the carrying capacity in urban settings, but actually urban areas can have carrying capacities that are way in excess of the surrounding rural areas, which is something that biologists really didn't think would happen. So again, how many is the right number of deer? Well, it depends, and it's based on the amount on the type of habitat and the quality of that habitat. So if it's cedar thicket, you can't have very many deer supported by that. If it's high quality habitat like out at the Kerr area, well, you can carry more deer then. One of the things about carrying capacity, biologists often talk about cultural carrying capacity. And this is, it's what will people tolerate? And it's often far above traditional carrying capacity. So we will tolerate a very high deer population, even one that is a detriment to the deer themselves. So what about the ecological impact? As I mentioned, deer are browsers. They browse woody plants and forbs. And we actually have plants. This is shin oak here on the left, and a cedar elm right here on the right. This cedar elm is kind of bonsai. It's probably should be about 10 feet tall. It's probably less than a foot. Shin oak will want to do lots of resprouts and actually form like a thicket. The habitat picture I showed of the Kerr area, that was of a shin oak thicket, and it should have lots of branches of lower growing shoots all the way around it. And basically, if anybody's familiar with a plum thicket, think of a plum thicket, and that's what it should look like, not a single tree. Just to, the ecological impacts, we go back to kaibab. I mean, when I was in college, we talked about kaibab, which is the plateau in Arizona. And the mule deer population in 1906 was about 4,000. The herd, because of controlling predators and such as that, the herd got to, and limiting harvest, the population got to 100,000 mule deer by 1924. And while I don't have any of the early photos showing the habitat in 1918, I do show the area in the 30s and beyond. A major, and as it's pointed out, there was a major die-off in 31, or a major die-off before between the 20s and the 30s, and the population went down to as little as 20,000. This is the kind of habitat damage that did. Basically, they were standing on their hind legs and reaching up and eating these evergreen trees, which is not really a preferred forage. Much of what you're seeing there that's low is sagebrush, which is not a preferred food. There's the same spot in 42 as after the population had exploded and basically permanently damaged the habitat there. And permanently altered it. And then here's a picture in 48. So you can see some of that recovering happening after the population had crashed. A great Aldo Leopold quote: "Just as the deer herd lives in mortal fear of wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer." And really, that's something we should be thinking about in the hill country. The impact to the habitat is dramatic. We look at this and we kind of go, that kind of looks like pretty good habitat. There's some grass there, there's some trees. One of the things that's missing, and actually the only low-growing plants you see, is cedar. And there is a definite browse line here, and all the woody plants are being eaten up to that point. So sometimes it's kind of deceptive as to the impact that's happening. Research in the Edwards Plateau have shown, in pecan bottoms, showed no reproduction because of high deer populations. There's other research on the reproduction in red oaks, and they had it was either non-existent or very low in the Edwards Plateau. So some of these ecological impacts include things like decreased flora and fauna density, decreased white-tailed deer quality, decreased wildlife habitat quality, increased erosion, decreased ecosystem stability, which is really can't be overstated at the importance of that, and even reduced water quality. In the Llano Basin in the 50s, there was a huge die-off because of high, and basically Llano Basin, that's around Llano, it's all the granite country north of Fredericksburg around Llano. And it was historically a high deer population area. And even in the 50s, and actually Parks and Wildlife used to do, in the 50s, did dead deer surveys. They would just walk transect lines, walk lines, and just count the number of dead deer. There were that many dead deer in the 50s. I talked about change in their weights, and you can just see it from the difference between the South Texas deer and the Edwards Plateau. And you go, are those different deer? Actually, the deer in South Texas were repopulated from deer out of the Edwards Plateau, so they're genetically the same deer, at least now. You know, again, very poor quality, disturbing looking health of deer because of the poor quality of the habitat. One of the things, and the impact to other types of wildlife. So golden cheek warblers, they need cedar, but they also need Spanish oak. That is an important component of good golden cheek habitat. And if you, and one of the things that I talk about is that really we're headed for a slow train wreck, because what we don't have is any reproduction on Spanish oak because of the high deer population for the past 50 years. So as these trees age out, there's not going to be any replacement trees if our deer population stays at the level it's at. Other species, bobwhite quail, are impacted because of forbs, right? That's the food for quail, those seeds from forbs. But also these species which tend to need low cover, hermit thrush, spotted towhee, and Louisiana water thrush. You know, I already said about forbs, and we can kind of see how that, and this is dayflower, which is actually is a great food for quail, but deer love it. But also, well, what else do forbs provide? That's insect food. And so they're impacting insect populations by decreasing so dramatically the forb population out there. Here's some damage from, actually, this is Axis. And it's actually, this community, this stream has changed from having native vegetation on it to ligustrum, to an exotic plant. And then another exotic's coming in and putting a browse line on the ligustrum. But you can see that this is not a healthy situation. We're having erosion going on. There's an unstable bank here. There's not a very low diversity. That's actually not only because of the animals, but also because of the exotic plants. And here's another shot. So browse line clearly on this habitat, and active erosion going on here. So what can, as I mentioned, water quality. So this increases turbidity from this erosion. And so that decreases water quality, and it'll impact aquatic life. We kind of don't think about deer impacting aquatic life in that way. And then also increased bacteria from fecal material, E. coli, basically. And that has actually showed up in a number of watershed protection programs. that they're looking at the deer populations in their watersheds and how that contributes to high E. coli levels. And then decreased base flow of a stream or a riparian area. The riparian sponge, if anybody's seen or heard Steve Nelly, he talks about the riparian sponge and this lack of vegetation along the shore, along a creek bed is where that riparian sponge should be and is not because of all the overbrowsing. Just on the San Clemente Islands off of the California coast, goats that were introduced caused responsible for the extinction of 8 endemic plants, meaning endemic means they only occurred on those islands, and endangered another 8 more. So we've kind of made a case for why we need to be concerned about high deer populations. What are the options? Basically, those options depend on where you're located. So rural large landowners, more than 250 acres, they have a set really options that smaller acreage landowners don't necessarily have. So rural landowners that are less than 250 acres, those are, there's more limitations to what they can do. Not so much from some from a permit standpoint, but more so from just being able to safely harvest deer and such as that. But then, then we talk about suburban, community, urban deer, and that is another challenge right there. So, what are some of the things? Well, the basic one is harvesting during the regular hunting season. There are managed land deer permits, MLDPs, and there's 2 different types. There's the conservation option and the harvest option. Then there's permits that Parks and Wildlife does that are called triple T's, trap, transport, and transplant. And basically it's trapping deer, moving them someplace else and letting them go. Problem is there's almost no place that in the state where they don't already have too many deer. And so there are very few places that Parks and Wildlife will approve a relocation like that. And that's why they got into what's called the trap, transport, and process. And basically that's trapping them, take them to a slaughterhouse, and then processing them. And then they have to be donated for food banks or for nonprofits that are feeding the hungry. So hunting during the regular season, TP, just for an example, TPW regulations for Kerr County allows up to 5 deer to be harvested, and it has a 2 buck limit. So you could shoot 5 does, and or you can shoot 4 does and 1 buck, or you can shoot 3 does and 2 bucks, but you can't shoot more than 2 bucks. And that's pretty much the regulation for all the surrounding counties around Kerr County. So how many deer are harvested by each active hunter? I'll let y'all, some of y'all have seen this presentation before, and so you know the answer. The answer is about 1 and a little bit more than 1. So you can look at, basically the last 20 years of data, and it had the highest it's been is like 1.4, so hunters are not shooting more than 1 or 1.5 deer per hunter on average. So that means some active hunters are shooting none, a few are shooting more, but most hunters are shooting around 1. That's probably pretty typical, but they can shoot 5 and they don't. So one of the things is Hunters for the Hungry. It's basically a statewide program for donating wild game, and its primary mission is to alleviate hunger and malnutrition in Texas, and provides an outlet for hunters who have more meat than they want. And it's promotes stewardship of the environment by increasing the harvest. So these go to basically food banks. And so a lot of processors do this. It does, there's a fee associated with it for the basic processing. They basically turn everything into hamburger, and then they give it to food banks. And actually, food banks really need this. A good source of protein is something they really don't have. So another concept is conservation hunters. And I talk about this and kind of have coined this. And conservation hunter is basically a hunter that harvests to improve the overall herd health. And they do it also to improve habitat health. And they're also providing, it's more subsistence, they're providing a healthy food source. So when we talk about locavores or being a locavore and eating local sources of food, there's nothing more local than harvesting meat from for axis or whitetail deer. And then also they harvest to feed the hungry in our community through programs like Hunters for the Hungry. So basically, I talked about the overabundance of deer, of whitetail deer and exotics. I talked about their basic biology, some of the population data that we have, the ecological impacts, and then I talked about some of the control options. So let's start there. And I think that hopefully what I should have mentioned right up front was that if you got a question, we can put it in the chat, or we can just, I'm happy to open up a discussion. And I think that Daryl was maybe going to help me with some of the chat. If there are any questions, we can put them in there about any part of my presentation or on the challenges. So how do we manage deer populations when they're so high?
So Rufus, it looks like we have two questions in chat right now, and one of them is from Elsa.
Okay.
And it was, is there an increase in trophy hunting that has increased the buck harvest?
So that's a good question. So trophy hunting is, so in Texas, subsistence hunting was really the, in the early days, that's what people did. And then in the early part of the 1900s of the last century, it switched to market hunting, and there was actually 75,000 deer hides shipped from Austin to back east for making into handbags and stuff in like the 1920s. Then we began to do regulations. Then trophy hunting became a thing. And because what we want to do is, if we're trying to control the population, we need to control the breeding side of the population, meaning the doe side. Sorry, ladies, but they are the ones that really control that the population control is related to. So if we shoot more bucks, one buck can still breed, numerous number of does. So it doesn't help us to harvest more bucks. Our population data and looking at the trends, remember, mainly it's about half and half, and even it's increased a little bit on the buck harvest. So most of the deer that are harvested, at least half of them, are bucks and not does, which is really what we need to do in order to control the population. So how do we increase that when we have that?
So I have another question from Ann Ryan. She asked, can you talk more about the riparian sponge and what is it?
Oh, okay, sure. So the riparian sponge, so when you have a vegetation that's growing on the edge of a stream, so riparian is streamside habitat. When you have that diversity of vegetation that's growing on the edge, when we have higher flows, those plants help to store and hold water within their root systems, and then slowly release it to the stream over time. And that's what we talk about when we're talking about the riparian sponge. So it's a way that the plant community holds water and allows it to be released, shallow water, and it allows it to be released and sustains that stream over time. If we lose that vegetation, then the stream becomes much more drought prone, and so will dry out faster. That's a good question.
So I have another question from Lucy. She asked, is there any type of deer sterilization done in Texas?
That's great. That's a great question. So in Texas, Texas Parks and Wildlife would be the ones that would have to authorize it. And there are, so deer sterilization. So there's two things related to deer sterilization. One would be physical sterilization through surgery. The other would be through birth control. And so for birth control, it's not currently allowed in Texas. There's no permitted other than for research. There's been some research on it. And currently there's not any good birth control for deer. The problem is that just like with people, you have, it's either managing testosterone or managing estrogen, and so it's a sex specific kind of treatment. So they need to be given to the doe. So that's why you can't just put a feed laced with some type of birth control in it. And it needs to be dosed properly in order to work well. And the way that it has been done in the past has been using the products that are Spayvac that has been used in the past has the problem is that you have to give them a shot. You either need to trap them or you need to dart them. But even if you dart them, you have to go back and give them a booster. Otherwise, they're not successful. Kind of like our COVID vaccine, but it's not as effective without the booster. So that means you got to somehow identify the deer that you've treated and then go back and retreat that animal. That is extremely difficult. It makes it very difficult. And the same is true of trying to do a surgical sterilization. There have been on very small like research facilities where they've been able to do that. But the problem is being able to capture enough of the deer to be able to do it. Now there's a dilemma. So if we sterilized half the deer population, because they're in such poor health, as health increased, the number that are still left out there, they're able to reproduce, are in better health and can have more fawns. So we will end up with a rebound in the population, even though we've treated a large percentage of the population. There was some research done on Johnson Space Center. So it's a high fence property, obviously down there in outside of Houston. And they realized that they had to get somewhere around 70% of the population to be able to have the treat 70% of the population to have it begin to decrease. So that's an incredibly high bar. So that's the reason that those techniques have not been successful and are extremely problematic. Now, we may get into the future where we have a more effective, less sex-specific kind of birth control, and that would really go a long way to potentially taking care of the population. But that's there's nothing on the horizon right now that I know of.
So I have a question from Jeff Schwartz, and he's asking, what do you think the freeze did to the deer population in the Edwards Plateau?
That's a good question. Actually, I think it will probably impact the axis population more than because they're really more of a tropical, subtropical species than is white-tailed deer, and white-tailed deer are more adapted to that. We certainly, in the past, we have seen with very cold snaps. I think that in 2011, we had the last pretty good cold snap ice storm we had, that we lost a number of deer, but it's a blip in the overall population. One of the things too is, so I'll go ahead and bring this up as part of the discussion. So what was the control mechanism? I mentioned predators with kaibab, but in Texas, we probably never had enough wolves or mountain lions to control the deer population. And really, the hill country was more prairie, and so it wasn't very good deer habitat. So it's mainly bison, and it was even antelope in the hill country, which says how open it was. But there was another control mechanism, and that was screwworms. And anybody who grew up in the hill country or grew up on a ranch in Texas is familiar with screwworms, and they're an insidious critter, and they basically lay their larvae in an open wound, and it caused significant amounts of mortality in deer populations. And basically, we controlled screwworms for the livestock industry by releasing sterile males, and the population of screwworms crashed. There's still screwworms in Mexico, and we continue to release sterile flies to maintain a low screwworm population in the United States. But it was the most significant probably mechanism on controlling deer populations. And when that changed was in the late 50s and early 60s. And that's when our deer population just takes off and just goes sky high. So that was the control mechanism. I don't think ranchers want us to bring that back. I don't think policy makers will allow us to make that come back. But it's important to understand that the predator-prey relationship, it was really a parasite. A pest that controlled the deer population, not mountain lions, not wolves. We have lots of coyotes, and they are not having a control on it.
So I had a question from Gary. He would like to know is why not open hunting season to all year?
That's it. Now that's a great. So now we're getting into the good part of the discussion. So that's a good question. So we do have, like with axis deer, and axis deer are probably our most numerous exotic, and the population continues to grow. We do not have a closed season on axis. Axis you can harvest year round. There is no bag limit. You're not limited to 5. You could shoot 20 in a day. You could do it. If you wanted to trap axis and sell them, you could do that. You can't do that with white-tailed deer without a permit. And so there's no bag limit on axis. There's no closed season on axis, and we still are not removing enough to control that. The other thing is actually hunters, they are very uncomfortable with the idea of harvesting deer when they think they may be, when they would have a sizable fetus in them. So they're not comfortable with doing that. And even if we did have an open season year round, it's doubtful that there would be any significant harvest, from, another month or two from now till the end of probably until middle September. The other thing is hunters also do not like the idea, and they are concerned about whether a fawn can survive. So a fawn can actually survive from a doe from its, being weaned from its doe at about 60 days. So most of them are born the first couple of weeks of June till 1st July. We get some late ones. Usually they're fawns that have been bred. So they were yearling, or they're actually not even a year yet. And they will be bred and very late, like this time of year. And it'll be their first cycle. And then they will have a very late fawn. So that's when we see those. But that's a great question. And an interesting flip side to that is, do we in other states, they will harvest as much as we do in Texas within a much shorter period of time. And wildlife managers have known for a long time that when you increase the length of the season, you do not typically increase the take of the animals. People go, oh, well, I'll go hunting later. But the sense of urgency when you only have a week or 2 weeks to hunt, you actually increase the harvest. So people are more focused on it and go out and they harvest more at that time. So it's an interesting dilemma. So even for quail, so if you wanted to reduce the quail harvest, you could change the bag limit, or you could lengthen the season, and you often will have the same result of decreasing harvest by increasing the season, because people will go, oh, I'll go later, and then they don't go. But so that's an interesting aspect there.
So Lucy would like to know, is there a study being done now of the storm and of deer dying?
Yeah, no, I'm sure there's nothing. It would be completely anecdotal based on, well, where they would see it is in their annual surveys, which Parks and Wildlife does annual surveys across the state. And the hill country is divided up into several deer management units, and they sample the population based on those deer management units. Not done by county, it's done by groups of counties. And so I think I threw up a graph of RMU or DMU, Deer Management Unit 5, which is around Kerrville, but goes into Gillespie and Kendall and Bandera. And so, but the kind of Balcones escarpment on the edge of the hill country, that's a different management unit. It might show up there. The other thing would be, and I said it's anecdotal, it will be that people will call about deer that have died, and they will call Parks and Wildlife and they will say, we found several deer that died. Usually the big thing, I remembered this, that while we're talking, is that what the worst kind of weather that we have for killing deer is, and especially axis, is a cold rain. And axis cannot handle a cold rain. And so we will have relatively speaking, large die-offs of axis in the spring when we have a very cold rain. So yeah, so we won't, they will not be doing any surveys specifically of it. They'll know from people calling, and then they may see it and if it's significant, they'll see it in their deer data from this summer when they get that.
So Jeff would like to know, how does hog populations affect deer population?
Yeah, so hogs will, they're very opportunistic. And so what he's getting at is that hogs will, if they come across a fawn, they'll eat it. And so they're carnivores, they're actually omnivores, so they'll eat anything they kind of come across. They'll eat plants, they They eat, insects. They'll eat dead things. They eat carrion. They'll eat live animals if they come across them and it's easy. So, but their impact is not. I mean, we have pretty much ubiquitous hogs across the Edwards Plateau, and it's not having an impact, a negative impact. Are there fawns that are lost? They probably are. Is it significant to the population? It's not. I don't know.
So
we may, Daryl, we may want to just do maybe one more.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say we have quite a few questions here, but I think we're running out of time.
Yeah. So if you want to ask one more, we'll do that.
Okay. So Linda would like to know, how do you treat deer showing signs of parasites?
You do not use. It is illegal to treat with a deer, wild animals with a. So, for instance, putting something out in their feed to try to control the parasites. That's illegal. The best thing to do is to stop feeding, because it's that concentration around the feeders that's causing them to pick up high parasite loads. If they're able to move around through the landscape and feed on natural food sources, they will not pick up as many parasites. It's them being concentrated. So that's the best thing you can do for them. And it's not legal to go out and treat wild populations. So Parks and Wildlife wouldn't be happy. So I'm going to skip over this. This is just kind of what you can do. We've already talked about some of it. One of them is, harvest deer if you can. And also, if you're not interested in harvesting, work with friends, do a wildlife co-op, and assist in processing and consuming this heart healthy product. Actually, I'm a heart patient, and it's very low food. The other thing you can do is grow priority plants, the ones that they like, and cage them where necessary. So the best thing, to save our ecosystem function is to eat more venison. I dedicate my presentation to my brother, Ben, and to my son, Ruth. And so with that, thank y'all very much for having me.
Well, I got a lot of that. Was a very interesting presentation, so I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yes, we thank you
Hey,
very
thank
much.
you, Rufus.
You bet.
Thanks, Rufus.
It was my pleasure. It is probably one of the toughest, management issues that we have, and I think everybody's got an opinion, and it's difficult. It's not an easy problem to try to solve, and so it deserves good discussion and probably a lot more in the future. So, but thanks for having me.
We
And
thank
thanks
you.
Thanks
you.
for having me earlier today with the class. That was great. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we've kind of had you tied up all day, so we appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
You bet.
All right, I don't have anything else, so it is about time to adjourn this meeting. Unless anyone has anything they need urgently to say, now is your chance. Katie, did you have something to say?
Let's eat more chili.